Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about how do you bring in JSON data using CSOM into a SharePoint list. Now, in the previous video, we talked about this random data coming from Macaru, and actually we just generate this random data. We have a few files, JSON files with 1,000 and a couple with 100,000 items, and we're going to store this in our local file system, and then use the CSOM. We're actually going to write a console, CSOM console job that will suck up that JSON from our file system and load it into a SharePoint list. So I have this job postings on list that's already loaded with 100,000 items. And then we're actually going to be playing around with this job postings 2 list so that way I don't disrupt that. So let's go ahead and get started. So if I go ahead and fire up Visual Studio, just create new project here. We're just going to create a standard console, .NET console application. And we're going to call this jobs sample. Let's just call it job sample 4, job sample data 4, and then go ahead and create on this. And this is just going to generate a standard C# project that's a console job. Now we want areas in here to where we want to separate our business layer from our actual job that's running. So we're going to dump all of our business logic into the services directory, and we're also going to have a separate directory for our models. So how we represent the JSON data before we actually load it in. In the services, let's just start creating a new class, and we just call this SP repo. And this is going to be our wrapper class, or our repo class, repository class that wraps everything dealing with SharePoint. So all of our SharePoint business logic as far as adding items, getting lists, and setting the context, we want to create that here. So let's go ahead and create our method to set the client, and this is going to be, let's just make this a public guy. It's going to return a client context get SP client, and what we need to do is pass in a URL. So as most of you know, that in order to generate a client context, you have to you start with a URL. So this is getting red squiggly because I don't have the CSOM library installed. So let's go ahead and grab that. So we go to Tools and NuGet Packet Manager, and then NuGet Packet Solutions. And I like to use the UI to actually browse for these. And I'm going to just do a general search on CSOM. And because I'm doing this against SharePoint 2013, I would just go ahead and select the 2013 CSOM NuGet package. Do an install here, hit accept. And once this is finished, we are good to go. So let's go back to our repo. Let's right click on this and let Visual Studio do all the hard work as far as writing the right assembly, using statement to bring that in. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish building this out. So we have a var, which is going to be our context, and we're going to set this equal to a new client context. And we're going to pass in the URL specified by the caller. And we want to return this context. And it's really as simple as that. Now, we're not going to get far with these 2 lines of code because we actually have to authenticate. So let's just go ahead and set up our authentication. So we do a ctx.credentials equals new network credential. If I spell this correctly. And then again, we get a red squiggly. It's just passing a parenthesis. Have .NET. Visual Studio. Go ahead and grab this guy. And this is going to be expecting a username and password. So let's go ahead and set those up. So just do a var for username. And we just do empty string for now. And ideally, these will come from your app config file. And then just go ahead and pass these guys in. All right, so now we are, and these are using network credentials. So if you're connecting to SharePoint Online, there is a different method or process that you have to go through in order to pass and create a network credential or security token for SharePoint Online. And you can do a Google search on how to do that. So because we're going against an on-prem against Windows Integrated Authentication, this is the line that's needed there. Okay, so in order to bring in the username and password, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just go ahead and copy over my app settings from a working project. So let me just go here, put in my app settings block, and basically we have the site URL, the list, the username and password. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this guy for the username, and so now we have code for the username and password. I'm going to just copy and paste this in, and basically this is just going to give me just pull that data directly from app settings. Okay, so this is just an app setting keys, and then I have a comment method that I have to create here. So let's go ahead and create that. And basically this is kind of like my catch-all utilities type method, static, everything that we need to do, something quick and dirty. We just want to drop into this class here. All right, and then we have our common, and basically all this guy is going to do, just get at settings method, static method, pass in the key. It has this configuration manager. Let's go ahead and bring this in. I'm not going to get a red squiggly, have that one resolved because I need to bring in another assembly manually. So system.configuration. You bring that guy in, then you right click, and then you have Visual Studio. Go ahead and fix that reference for you. But basically from the configuration manager, that already has an app settings key. And the reason why we wrap this is because if you specify a key that's not defined in the config file, or is invalid key name than what you're expecting in the config file, it just returns an empty string. And what we want to do, we have this wrapper that will actually throw an exception, so it's easier to debug versus object not set to an instance of a reference, or those type of ambiguous type errors. Okay, so that's why we do that wrapper. So let's go ahead and back to our SP repo. Now we pretty much have everything together. So we're connected to our SharePoint instance, again, remotely using CSOM. And now let's write a method that will return the actual list. And this is going to pass in a title. Let's just say list title. And our list would just be this guy here. And we take the context. So actually what I want to do is make sure that we have a local context here. So let's go ahead and do some more plumbing up here before we actually can set up our list. Let's do a SP repo, create our constructor. And here again, we're expecting the caller to specify which URL, because that defines everything for the context. And then we want to have this private member that's just going to hold on to our context as we get created, and then reuse that guy when and where it's needed. So this guy is just going to set our internal member, so get SP context, pass in the URL, and now we are good there. So that's the purpose of the constructor. And for this get list, we're just going to leverage that internal member, webs list, and then there is a get by title, and then we just specify the title name. All right, now once we have the list, you probably want to load it, so this way you hydrate any base properties based on this list, and then you do an execute query, and this will actually hydrate that local variable list for you. Oops. Execute query, and then return the list. All right, so obviously we can do more error handling here. Like after the execute query, you need to confirm that this is actually hydrated and didn't return null and all this other good stuff. So, but I'm not gonna do that here. Just trying to keep this simple, keep this basic and very high level. All right, so I think we have all of our pieces to the puzzle in place. So now let's go to our program, And you know, the intent is to try to keep this as clean as possible by encapsulating or hiding all of that business layer into those various services directories. So the first thing we want to do here is just test out our repo. So let's get a new SP repo and just have Studio fix this for us. And this is going to be expecting the URL. So we want to have a little bit more control over, from a caller perspective, and call that URL from the config file. And this is just going to be, what do we name it? Key value site URL. So just copy this, drop this in programs. That's going to give us the URL, pass the URL to our repo. Our repo should be good now. Then we get the list, and we just call, wait, why do we have a rec squiggly here? Oh, protection level. I need to make this constructor public. So let's just go here, make that public. Everything should be happy now, right? And from the repo, we simply call, because all the hard work is done in the repo and the constructor, so now we just do get list and we specify the list name. And it really should be this simple. So let's just write this out, make sure everything is connecting correctly. And list.title. And I want to specify that the name that the class name for this variable versus using var, because I know I need the client object, this SharePoint client assembly reference here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Let's see if we're connecting to our SharePoint remotely and we're able to communicate that way. All right, so I did a write line. That was pretty quick. I forgot to add the console.read line, and this would just allow me to see the output before the command screen goes away. All right, so now we're connected. So we have job postings. It returned a list. So now we're connected to our list and we're good to go there. Okay, awesome. So now what we need to do, let's go ahead and create one more service or class, and this is going to be our data repo. And we're actually going to make this a static class because basically it's a very simple class for right now, but there's room to grow. And what we want to do is put everything dealing with our data inside of this class. So the first thing we want to do is get JSON from file. So let's just make this public static, and this is going to return a string. Get JSON from file, and then you just pass in, the caller is going to pass in the file path, and let's just do var JSON, just set it equal to empty string, and then return that. Okay, so basically this is just going to find that JSON file on our local file system and dump the content of that JSON file inside of this local string variable, and then return that back. It's really that simple and that straightforward. So really nothing earth-shattering there. And this is surprisingly very easy to do using the string, the system on the I/O assembly. There's a stream reader. Right, and let's just go ahead and bring this guy in. And we're using the using statement, so as soon as we use everything that we need from this particular object, we're going to set this, flag this as ready for garbage collection. Okay, and then the file path is what they're going to pass in. So the string reader is the one that's going to take in this file, hydrate the actual file, open the contents of it, and read it, and set it equal to this reader. And then the reader, the local reader object, we can just do read to end. And that's going to hydrate this JSON, and we're going to turn it back. So all the contents of that JSON file is going to be stored here as a string and then returned back to the caller. Okay, so let's do a Control KD to get everything formatted, and I think we're looking good. Let me just do a quick build to make sure there's no syntax errors. All right, so we're good there. So we have our SP repo, we have our data repo. Now let's go to our program and call in that JSON. So the first thing we want to do is drop all that JSON here, get our data repo, get JSON from file, and then it's looking for the file path. And I'm hard coding a lot of this stuff here because, again, this application is really meant to be a developer tool to load in JSON into a SharePoint list. In our case, it's sample data. So, you know, obviously, if you want to make this production ready or more robust, anything that I'm hard coding, you probably want to go ahead and drop in a config file and give you that much more flexibility there. All right, so this guy lives at test data, and what do we call it? So let me pop this guy in. So test data, and we want to go after the jp postings.json. This is actually our file here. So let me just copy the name here and within that test data directory right off the C drive and paste that guy here. And I got it red squiggly because just to properly escape these, you need a double backslash that would escape these correctly. So get it from JSON, and we dump out all that information there, and then we do the golden tool, which is really pretty magical, by using the Newtonsoft library, JSON.NET library. So basically, the guy that we need is from this convert file. Actually, let me just copy and paste this line of code here. And I think this line of code is probably the most important line of code within this entire video, and I'll talk through that soon. So JSON convert, this guy does not exist. So we have to go to NuGet again and grab that package. Again, that's just going to be Newtonsoft JSON, which is our JSON.NET, and then we just install this guy. All right, and then we go back to programs, right click on this, let Studio fix our references for us. It won't be able to fix this guy because this job item is a model. Let's go ahead and create this guy really quick. So just go to class job item. This is going to be our model, and I'm gonna just go ahead and copy this chunk of code. So any other code that's really not, it's more tedious than anything else, I'm just copying those in, so that way we don't have to sit through here and watch me type all of this nuanced data. And basically what this class or this model is doing, really this could be an interface, because all it does is hold property information. It has zero logic or anything like that. It's just a suite of properties that represents this object. And basically these names are a direct reflection of the names here from my test data. So if you look at this JSON, if I go into preview mode, all of these names here, the casing, the spelling notes, all the good stuff is when I'm naming my properties. And if you do this, you allow Newtonsoft to do what it's very good at, and that's to map that JSON data directly into a type safe object and even a generic collection to where you can use this seamlessly and with one line of code. And that one line of code is this guy here. So let's go ahead and bring this in, and then let's walk through what exactly is happening here. So let's do, what's going on? Oh, you're not playing nice now. Okay, so it's gonna make me manually type this in. So that's fine. That's fine. So job sample data for models. That's all you have to bring in. I don't know why my quick action was locking up on me. All right, so we brought this guy in, and basically, if we build this from scratch, we are doing a list collection, right? And we calling it job item type. This is pretty standard, right? And let's just dump down to collection. And then we call our Newton Soft special converter, like Cadillac converter, JSON converter, right? Deserialize, JSON convert, sorry. Deserialize the object of this type. Now, if that JSON only represents a single item, this is where you would do job item. But because that JSON file represents a collection of job items, right, that's why you want to do this double type here. One, really, you're just doing the list, but the list expects a type defined since it is a generic type. And then you pass in the string, right? And that's going to take all that string value, type all those objects within the JSON to job item, store them in the list collection, and that's going to be this guy here. So now we are ready to rock and roll. Once that's done, you actually have that JSON into C# type save, and you can iterate through that as if you would with any collection. So for each var job in jobs, and then really just spit these out. So console dot write line job item job title, right? So that's my property name. And because this guy here is 100,000 items, I only want to spit out the first, let's say first 50. So I'm gonna take the first 50 and spit those out. So if everything is lined up correctly, we should be able to see this data. So let's give it a try. Right, and that's our data. So that's all our JSON there. And our last item is we have the job posting list. All right, so really it's that simple. And the cool thing about this single line here is that because this takes in a string, right now we're just pulling this from a local file system, but there's nothing to write an HTTP client method that pulls this from a remote service, right? So very, very powerful stuff. Like these two lines right here is probably the most important lines out of this entire video, because this can potentially be an integration point for many different scenarios. Whatever you need to integrate with SharePoint, as long as you can expose it as JSON, you can write something similar to this to bring that data into SharePoint in very few lines of code. Okay, so now that we have that JSON and we have it, wrapped into SharePoint, wrapped into C#, now we need to dump it into SharePoint. So let's move our for each loop down to this area here after we grab our SharePoint list. And what we want to do is now let's add in another method within our SharePoint repo to actually add a job posting to a specified list. So let's go here. Let's just copy this guy. So let's just do this. Let's say add job item, and then we can specify actually we want it to pass in the list. So we want the caller to do all of the work to grab this list, confirm the list exists, and all this other good stuff. But we want to pass that in once they do all that work. And then we also want them to pass in the job item. So let's bring in our model so our repo class can understand that. And right now, let's return void. But another option you want to do, especially when you're dealing with adds, deletes, or any of those other actions that modify data, maybe you want to return a Boolean value if it was successful or not. But for right now, just for brevity, we're going to just return a void. And what we're going to do here, C context, so for this list, there is a add item, right? But this add item takes in this special guide, list item creation information. So we have to create that first. Let's just call that list item creation information. And we're just going to create an instance of that and then just pass it in. What happened? Did I not spell it right? List item creation. Oh, new. Right? All right, so that's our LI. We pass our LI here. And basically what this is going to return is an instance of a new item. And then what we do is take that new item, and that's a SharePoint list item, and extract all the properties from here and map them to the site columns here. And I have a piece of code that does that. Again, this is just a mapping exercise, so it's not something that we should be sit here and watch me type through. So the mapping exercise, we're just going to map that in. Let's comment this out for now. That's my logger. And once you do this mapping, and in the previous video, this is what we talked about. For the publishing image, we have to do the special image tag notation. All the other ones, we just set them as values. There's no additional manipulation are needed, and it just maps over quite nicely. And the last thing you have to do is you have to do a new item update, right? And then you want to call the underlying CTX context execute query, and that's what sends it over to SharePoint, so it actually can be written to the SharePoint list. All right, so if this is correct, we should be able to save this off, go back to our program section, and right before we spit this out as a write line, let's call our SP repo and add item, and it's expecting a list, so we already did the work to do that. And then for this particular item within the collection, the job posting within the collection, we want to pass that in. Let me do a Control KD to make sure that all this looks okay. All right, so a couple things I want to do. So let's switch back over to SharePoint and see exactly what we have from a list perspective. So we have this job posting 2. This is the one we want to play with. So I'm going in the code, let's rename this to job postings 2 as a list item. Let's move this right line up to right after we grab the list, so that way we can ensure we actually grab the list, or we read out when we actually grab the list. And then after that, we will actually go ahead and add a job item and then a title. All right, let's see if this works. So here we go with the console. It says added. Let's see if it's actually adding. So if we go back to SharePoint, we're in this job posting 2, 13,930, hit refresh, 947, hit refresh, 951. So this is actually adding these items in. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop that. So very powerful stuff, right? I mean, we actually walked through the code within 28 minutes of adding, integrating external JSON into a SharePoint list, right? And of course, this is a batch, but you can get these are the underlying pinnings that are needed if you want to do like a REST API call, or if you want to do like a job on a scheduled time. Maybe you want to do deltas and only bring in the deltas from an external JSON file or service, or the possibilities are endless. But what I want to do now, so I want to do one last piece, right, and show you that the way that we wrote this so far is pretty basic, right? This is pretty basic. And in the next video, what we want to do is show or walk through the process on how we can make this more efficient. So every time that this is doing a write line, that's an execute query that's coming from a remote server without SharePoint installed, which our console job will run on, and send that over the network to SharePoint that sits remotely. And this may be on-prem in the SharePoint farm that you have on-prem in your local data center, or it can be SharePoint Online that sits in O365, so on and so forth. But that execute query, when we look at this guy, go to definition, this is very expensive. And what we're doing is just a single thread application, meaning that we're only doing this on a single thread and we're doing these one at a time. Now, one way that you can speed this up, and you kind of did a preview of this in the previous video, is to do these in batches, right? So there's no reason why we have to do this execute query. Why we have to do this execute query one item at a time. We can create 10 items as an example and then do an execute query, and this will be a little bit faster. So let's just take this as a starting point and add jobs. And basically what we're going to do, so we want to separate this out a bit. So in our add item, the key piece is you want the caller to control when they call the execute query. So add job item should just do that. Really, it should just create a new item and add it. But when we send it over to the remote SharePoint server, we want the caller to have more control over that. So for a add item job, this is just going to return the list item. So we allow it to, let's just X this out. We allow it to create this, and then it needs to return the new item that was created. Okay. And really, separation of concern, it only has one job on. And really, the main purpose of this method is this mapping exercise here. So, anytime there's a new item added, you go to this method here, remap it to the new site column based on the new sample data or an object, or probably within the JSON, and map it that way. And this is going to return the new item that was created. So in this guy, we want to change this to add job items, right? And instead of sending us the caller sending us a single item, we want it to send us the entire collection, everything that needs to be added. And then we just turn this to jobs. And here we actually have our for each loop, right? And basically for every sample data or object in that JSON, we can create a new item, and we just call our add item with the list that's specified for this particular job, right? And that's going to return the new item. Now, once we have this new item, let's pull our execute query. Control KD. Oops. Control KD. All right. So once we have our new item, we're still going to call execute query, and that's going to add that item to the SharePoint list. So let's just make sure we didn't break anything. So the modification we have to do here in our programs, and instead of having the console job do all of this work, iterate through the collection and all this other good stuff, it's basically just going to call our repo method. So we have a add job items plural, and then just tell it to give us all the jobs, right? That's coming from our collection, our string, so give us everything. But basically, again, we only want to test with, let's test with 100. We only want to test with 100 of these guys versus they hold 10,000. And then our console, let's just remove that, and we have to do two lists to make the type safe. Let's do a control KD. All right, so now this will add in all of our items. So we're losing our screen read, right? So let's do this one last piece here. Let's add in a logging service. Just call this logger.cs. And really what this is going to do is encapsulate all of our logging. And again, I'm going to just go ahead and copy all of this out, so that way we're not sitting here typing all this in. And let's just make this a static class, so public static. And these are just going to be static methods to where if it's informational or a warning or an error, right now we're just console writing line these out to the screen. But we can make this, we can grow into using like a logger for net or a system.trace or any other logging service that will wrap it. But for right now, we're just going to wrap all of our calls with these with this logging service, and it's simply just going to write line those out. Okay. So let's go to our program. Well, I think we're fine there, but if we go inside of our repo, instead of doing a console write line here to kind of lock this in, let's just use our logging service to write these out. So we want to log out informational that we just wrote. We just added this item to the SharePoint list. So edit item, and let's just do job again, job.title, same as we had, same as we had in our program.cs file, right? So we're just going to write that out there and perform an execute query. So basically it really gets added here. So let's kind of technically be correct on when it's actually being added. All right. So let's do a let's read this out. Let's see what happens. Just make sure that we didn't fat finger anything and this thing is still reading out. Okay, so our code modifications were correct. Let's go to the list. Where are we? We're at 13.958, hit refresh. 14.3.4, hit refresh. 14.3.9. Okay, so we're still writing, so we're still good. All right, so now what we want to do is make this a little bit more efficient. So I talked about how this execute query is the one that's causing us a lot of grief. Now, if we look at how can we do this in batch, we pretty much just need to control when we call this execute query and run this as many times as possible before this execute query is called. So in order to do that, let's just have the caller pass in. We'll give them a little bit more control. Actually, let's not do that. Let's just call, batches, and we'll set this to 20. And basically what this number is going to do, this is going to say, hey, add 20 items before you call execute query. Send those over within the batch, right? So what we need a counter. So our current count, set this equal to 0. And before we execute query anything, we just increase our count so that would represent the first item. And let's just wrap this in the if statement, or execute query in the if statement, and basically only when the count equals batches do we actually want to call this. So once we have 20, that's when we want to call it. So when count is greater to or equal to batches, we want to call execute query. Then we need to reset our count, reset the count to 0. All right. And so let's do a control. Let's get this all formatted correctly. So let's log this out. Let's just call this okay. Let's say queued item, right? Because we're doing is queuing this up. Because if this fails, then everything in the batch does not go over. And then we'll write line when we actually call execute query. Okay, and then we reset the count, and then we should be good to go. I think this should work. Let's give this a try and let's see what happens. Let's just do this in batches of 5 for now. Lower the number, lower the expectation. All right, so let's see. If we want to do 5, let's see what happens. Queued 5, and execute query. Right. So if we go over to hit refresh. 1439, refresh again, 126. So these are writing over in batches, okay? All right, so now we went through that. Now what we can do, let's just up this to 50, and then let's spit it out. So now it's doing 50 at a time. And it's done, right? And it's done. So, so that's just another way on how, depending on how you structure your CSOM code, if you're able to do things in batches, you can get things right into the SharePoint list quite quickly. The only concern or issue or scenario that this pattern does not take into account is when there are times to where you have to call execute query many times, right, for a single unit of work. If we kind of break this down into a unit of work, adding this job item is a unit of work. So we are actually able to, do many units and then call execute query because this is just the nature of it. But if you were provisioning, say, for example, a SharePoint site, right, and you want to do all that through CSOM, add in your default document libraries, your default list, and all this other good stuff, you're going to have to, for a site to be completed, you're going to have to call execute query several times within that process, and then a final execute query to actually create the site. Or you create the site, or once all those steps are done for that particular site, you call execute query, just call that site done. Now, there's a different pattern that you have to do, and really you have to kind of look at a synchronous pattern and a multi-thread pattern, and that's something that we will cover in the next video. But based on what we've done here, we increased this count tremendously by doing this in batches, but as I mentioned before, every scenario may not fit into this pattern. So we'll talk about that more in the next video. So in the meantime, take care. Again, if you like this video, please like it or share it to another developer on your team, someone who's writing CSOM code, or you're writing CSOM code. Let's just kind of spread the word on how different efficient ways to write this. And then in the next video we'll go through an asynchronous pattern. All right, take care. I'll talk to you.